Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to focus on plants, but I just want to remind you that you need to keep up with your study guides, you need to keep up with your labs, make sure you don't get behind on your work. So make sure you keep up. If you need help, let me know. Don't feel alone. You can talk with other people in the class and you can talk with me via email. So please make sure you keep up with everything that's going on. I want you to spend a second and just think about what a plant is. So you could stop this recording and just kind of jot down some ideas about what you think is a plant. Well, I'm going to give you a list of characteristics that we use to describe plants because it does take a list of characteristics. You know, humans describe plants, we make up the name plants and we describe what they are, and this is what we use to tell people what plants are. So all plants that we have in the plant kingdom are going to be multicellular, they're going to be eukaryotic, so they do have those more complex cells with the nucleus. They are autotrophic, so most of them are autotrophic, that is, they produce their own food, but some of them are truly parasitic, where they rely off the juice, suck the juices out of other plants and rely on other creatures in order to survive. But most are autotrophic. The cell wall is made of cellulose, so this outer protective covering around all their cells is made out of cellulose, and that's different than like fungi. Fungi have chitin that makes up their cell wall. So at the tips, and I'm just pointing here to you so you can see this, but at the tips of their roots and shoots, so this would be a root, but at the very tip of this, we have these very special areas of rapid cell division called apical meristems. So over here we have like a leaf, a primordial leaf, and this is a little bud right there. Maybe that's going to become a new leaf or maybe a flower. Here you can see in this axillary area, this would be like a mature leaf over here. But if that leaf is picked, that little bud right there will undergo rapid cell division and produce a new leaf. So in the areas at the tips of a plant and at the roots of a plant, they have these areas of rapid cell division called apical meristems. They also have a life cycle that is called an alternation of generations. And this is going to seem very strange to you because there's really not any way that this is like exactly like humans, how humans do our reproduction and our life cycle. But we could go ahead and start anywhere in this life cycle. Let's start over here with fertilization. So in fertilization, we have gametes, sperm cells and egg cells, which are haploid. Now remember, haploid means you only have one set of chromosomes. So these sperm cells and egg cells that are haploid, they will come together and fuse, and they will form a zygote. The zygote now is diploid because you had the union of two haploid cells. That zygote will undergo lots and lots of mitosis, just normal cell division, and it will produce a sporophyte. The sporophyte is the spore-producing plant in this particular life cycle. Now, plants will exist as two different kinds of things. It'll consist of a sporophyte and it'll consist of a gametophyte. The job of the sporophyte is to undergo meiosis, reduction division, to produce spores. Okay, and so there's no equivalent to what humans do. In meiosis, humans produce sperm cells and egg cells, but in plants, sporophytes undergo meiosis to produce haploid spores. Now, because it undergoes meiosis, reduction division, the spores are haploid. They only have one set of chromosomes. And these haploid spores will undergo lots of mitotic divisions, lots of cell division. And when they go through the cell division, they're going to produce gametophytes. And gametophytes, the way I remember it is just by looking at the name, gametophyte means gamete producing plant. So this is going to be the plant that produces gametes. Okay, now a gametophyte is not a sporophyte. It doesn't become a sporophyte. So in plants, some parts of a plant life cycle, some members of the plant group are going to be sporophytes, but other members of the same thing are going to be gametophytes. So that's kind of strange. You need to sit and kind of look at that a little bit. But just remember that sporophytes produce spores by meiosis. Gametophytes produce gametes and they're going to do it by the process of mitosis. And you might say, well, how did they produce sperm cells and egg cells by mitosis? Well, remember, a gametophyte is already haploid. It already has only one set of genetic material inside of each of its cells. So it's already haploid. It can undergo meiosis in order to produce gametes. And those gametes will undergo fertilization, and the life cycle continues on. So this is something you can say about all plants, that it has an alternation of generations, and we go from being a haploid state to being a diploid state, back and forth, and that's the life cycle. Now we're going to look at all different kinds of plants through the course of this class, but all the plants that we look at are going to follow this general theme. They're going to have differences in sizes of gametophytes and sporophytes. Sometimes the sporophyte will be dominant, sometimes the gametophyte will be dominant. So, and they have all different kinds of structures, but they're going to follow this general pattern. You know, when I think about biology, I'm always looking for patterns in nature, and this is a pattern that all plants will share. Now, now plants also produce embryos, and these are multicellular structures formed from the zygote. So that is a unique characteristic to plants, and it separates them from some of the algae cells. So in our understanding of plants today, we call plants monophyletic. So the plant kingdom is monophyletic. Now remember, monophyletic means that these creatures share a common ancestor, and all of the plants come from that common ancestor. So that's what monophyletic means. And we think that the ancestor of all plants is some kind of an algal cell. We do have algal cells that are alive today, like chlorophyta and charophyta. These algae cells look very, very similar to plants. Some people even, as you see in this little diagram here, some people even think that they are plants and will call them plants. So others won't call them plants, but they'll call them protists. So they do have a lot of characteristics of plants. They share common ancestry of plants. We've done genetic testing on them, and they appear to be ancestors of plants. So the plants we're going to be talking about today are going to be the liverworts, the hornworts, the mosses. Okay, these are have different kinds of names to them. Some people call them non-tracheophytes because they don't have vascular tissue. Tracheids is a name we use for vascular tissue. We'll also talk a little bit about club mosses and ferns, and those are going to be considered tracheophytes because they do have vascular tissue, but they're non-seed tracheophytes. They don't produce seeds, but they do have vascular tissue. And then later at another lecture, we'll do seed plants. We'll do the conifers and the flowering plants and finish up the plant kingdom. So we think that plants started out in aquatic habitat, and an aquatic habitat has unique characteristics. For example, plants, the early plants that were growing in these aquatic habitats, all of their cells were surrounded or are close to water. Since they're in water, they have dissolved minerals all around them. They don't have to have roots to go get those minerals. So land plants have to have roots to get minerals. So carbon dioxide and oxygen, which is going to be, useful to them. Oxygen being used by the mitochondria to produce ATP, and carbon dioxide being used in a process of photosynthesis. All of these gases are dissolved in the water. So that's how the plants would extract them from the water. Plants, early on in aquatic habitats, they don't have to worry about gravity. They're gravity neutral because they have, their weight is supported by the water. So they're basically floating in water. To get gametes from the sperm cells and egg cells from one place to another, they have motile gametes. Typically, the sperm will swim to the egg. So those things are motile. They have the ability to move through the water. All cells are photosynthetic, not just one cell or one group of cells like in some of the modern day land plants. And this is a representative of maybe what the early plants might have looked like. This is called charophyte algae, and you can see it looks like a plant. It is an algae because it doesn't have all the characteristics of plants, but it has many of the characteristics of plants. And as I showed you in that cladogram just a slide ago, some people do include it as a plant. So this is what some of the early algae that evolved into plants kind of look like. So let me talk about a few features shared by plants and the charophyte algae, just to indicate to you that even though it's an algae, it has many features that are shared by plants. One of the characteristics is that the pigments, that is the chlorophyll and carotenoids, these are the same between plants and this algae. They do have chlorophyll A and B, and then they have various kinds of carotenoids that help them to undergo photosynthesis. Charophyte algae and plants both use starch as a reserved fuel source. So when they undergo photosynthesis, they store the starch inside of their bodies and use it as a fuel source for later on. So they do have cell walls made of cellulose. There is in their spores, they actually have a hard material. This is the most durable organic material known in plants, sporopollenin. And so their spores are supported by the sporopollenin, and it protects them from physical assaults from the environment. Now, sporopollen is so strong that we have fossil pollen. So that sporopollen allowed them to remain and to be fossilized. So we know what the environment looked like thousands of years ago because we find the spores from the plants that existed at that time and then speculate as to what the climate might have been like in the weather. So both charophyte algae and plants undergo mitosis, and in mitosis they form a cell plate. So that's a little bit different than how animal cells undergo cell division. They are multicellular, both of them. They have branched and apical growth, so they have growth from the root-like structures and all the way to the tips of the plant the body of the organism. So they have apical growths from both ends. And both of them undergo the alternation of generations. And both of them do practice oogamy. This is where we use egg cells and sperm cells to undergo sexual reproduction. So what problems did the early plants have to overcome to transition to living on land? There were a lot of obstacles that had to occur in the evolution of plants from going from being in the water to being on land. Now, we think that plants lived in water first because that's where we find the fossils. The earliest fossils are aquatic organisms, and then we find later on that plants move from water to land. So some of the steps that had to be overcome was how do you disperse your gametes in a dry environment? So, the early plants were in water and it was easy for them to have their sperm cells swim to the egg cells. But when you get into a dry environment, modern day plants, the most advanced modern day plants, don't use water in order to get the gametes from one plant to another. So this was something that had to be overcome. Can you think of any ideas about how modern day plants transport their sperm? Some of you are allergic to it. So how do you protect the zygote from drying out? This was another thing that had to be overcome. How do you take up water and nutrients from below ground? Because before, plants were essentially taking water from they were getting water and minerals directly from the water they were sitting in. How do you get carbon dioxide from the air? Remember, aquatic plants take up carbon dioxide directly from the water, but modern day advanced land plants don't do that. So how do you resist gravity? How do you transport water and nutrients long distances? The first land plants, or the first aquatic plants, they just absorbed the nutrients and water right through all their bodies. They didn't have to worry about transporting it long distances. But that is something that modern day land plants have to figure out to overcome. Okay, so we'll talk about some of those transitions as we go through this lecture. So our oldest fossils to date are about 550 million years. At least that's what makes it into our modern textbooks. Maybe it's a little bit older than that. It seems like we discover new fossils all the time. So plants have been around for a pretty long time. This is just showing you a little cladogram here of plants. So you can see where these red bars are. There's distinct characteristics that all the creatures above that little bar will share in common. So for example, your liverworts, mosses, hornworts, fossil plants, and vascular plants, all of these are going to be multicellular. They have multicellular embryos, they have sporopollenin, to shield the spore from being damaged. They have male parts and female parts. The antheridia is the male part that produces sperm, and the archegonia are going to be the female parts that produce eggs. So all of these creatures above that particular point right there are going to have those characteristics. About 450 million years ago, we have a diversification. We have liverworts coming off. Then we have the development of stomata. These are little breathing holes on leaves or leaf-like structures that allow the organism to bring in carbon dioxide. And you can see moss have that and hornworts have that. We then have a sporophyte that's persistent, and we'll talk about what that means. And then we have an independent branching sporophyte that forms, and then eventually vascular tissue that forms. Okay, so each of these little steps that you see are there as a transition point. They're structures that are forming to help plants become more and more adapted to being terrestrial, to living on land, moving away from being aquatic. Okay, so our first plant group that we're going to talk about are the bryophytes, and these have first appeared 450 million years ago or so. And there's only 25,000 species that are known today. And I say only because that's not a whole lot of species compared to like flowering plants where you have more than 250,000 species that are known today. So bryophytes, their habitats range in elevation from sea level all the way up to tops of mountains, 5,500 meters or perhaps more. They're pretty hardy creatures. Bryophytes of all phyla often have mycorrhizal fungi, so those are those mutualistic fungi that help them to absorb water. And bryophytes don't have roots. They have root-like structures. To be defined as a root, you have to have vascular tissue, and bryophytes don't have vascular tissue conducting fluids through their body. So there are three phyla of bryophytes, and we're going to talk about liverworts, hornworts, and mosses. These are what some bryophytes might look like. I just shown you here. Over here is a liverwort. So these are what they look like, and this is what moss looks like. You're probably more familiar with moss than you are with liverworts and hornworts. And hornworts look like little horns sticking up. So we'll talk about each of these groups following here. Okay, so bryophytes have certain characteristics. One of their major characteristics is that they're seedless. That is, they don't produce seeds. Many of you have eaten seeds before. You've eaten pumpkin seeds or sunflower seeds, or perhaps you've eaten beans. Those structures are very complex structures, and they hold embryos. And bryophytes don't produce those particular structures. So they do produce spores. Spores are little vegetative cells that are going to undergo mitosis to produce a gametophyte. So that's what a spore is. So another characteristic of bryophytes is that they have flagellated sperm. So they have sperm that have flagella. Now, why do you think they have flagella? So you're correct. They actually have flagella, so the sperm can swim through water, and bryophytes are going to be tied to water. They're going to actually swim through water to find the egg cells so they can fertilize the egg cells. So these bryophytes are non-vascular. They do not contain vascular tissue. Therefore, by definition, they don't contain roots, stems, or leaves. They have root-like structures, stem-like structures, and leaf-like structures, but they don't actually have true root, stems, or leaves. Now, because of these characteristics that they have, the flagellated sperm and being non-vascular, this limits their size, so they're relatively small. So if you walk around your yard or you walk around a stream, you'll see all kinds of bryophytes, but they're not going to be huge, not like a tree or a flower or something of that nature. Because of the characteristics that it has, it actually limits where they can live. So they have unique niches. Typically, these niches are places that are either harsh, living on surface of rocks where other creatures, other plants can't live. They oftentimes will live in very wet areas. So they are limited in where they live. They have to live sometimes near water or somewhere where it rains. Typically, they like a lot of humidity and moisture. They do have little rhizoids. These are little root-like structures that allow them to anchor themselves in the substrate that they're living on. Those little rhizoids also help them to absorb water and minerals. And remember, there are mycorrhizae that may be on those little rhizoids. They do have leaf-like structures that undergo photosynthesis. And in this particular group, it actually has a dominant gametophyte stage. So the sporophyte, so if I just so perhaps I'll just draw a little moss plant here and show you, this is going to be a gametophyte. There's little rhizoids anchoring in the soil, but it's going to have a dominant gametophyte. This will be the gametophyte, the haploid stage of this, and it's going to grow a sporophyte out of the gametophyte. That sporophyte will be dependent upon the gametophyte, and it might actually not last very long. The gametophyte might last for years and years and years, and the sporophyte will dry up and die after it releases its spores from the little sporangium here at the end. Okay, so it has a dominant gametophyte. Not all of these creatures are going to have a dominant gametophyte. Some of them are going to have a dominant sporophyte, and that's part of the evolution. If you see that little thing wagging there, that's Becky. So Becky came over here to greet me for a minute as I'm doing my lecture. So I'm going to pet her for a minute and as I'm continuing to do the lecture. So liverworts are our first group of bryophytes that I want to talk about. I don't know if you've ever seen a liverwort before, but they're awesome creatures. I have them in my yard, and every time I see them when I'm walking down a creek, I enjoy looking at them. I think they're amazing creatures and they're interesting. Unfortunately, there's only about 7,000 species of them. And they're really kind of cool creatures. They can reproduce sexually. They produce sperm cells and egg cells. But they also have the ability to produce asexually. They have these little gemma cups. And I don't see one here, but they'd be little cups on the surface of these thalloids. And inside those cups, they have these little structures that form when a water drop comes down, it actually splashes in there and shoots those little gemmy all over the place, those little asexual structures, and those will form new liverworts. So kind of cool that they have several different ways to reproduce. There's two major types. There's kind of more of a leafy-like liverwort, and then there's a thalloid liverwort. You'll see a thalloid liverwort over here. Leafy liverwort's going to have more leaf-like looking structures. So these are just some different representatives of it. You can see these are leaf-like structures here. You can see the leaf-like structures. So these are representative of leafy liverworts, and there's all different kinds of them. They are hard to sometimes identify. There is other things that look like them, and they do look like moss. But if you get somewhat familiar with them, you can go out and look and find liverworts. These, to me, are the easier liverworts to find. These are the thalloid liverworts. And we have the fragrant liverwort that is around here. And if you take and crush one of the leaf-like structures, the little thalloid structures, it has a nice little scent to it. So these are very common in streams. If you ever walk a mountain stream, you should be able to see liverworts all over the place. There's some trails over at Anglers Park in Danville, the city of Danville. They have all these walking trails, and there's streams that you can walk by that have all kinds of thalloid liverworts. Marchantia is one of the more common kind of like model species of liverworts that many people have studied, and they're a beautiful liverwort, as you can see here. This is the upper surface of Marchantia. And you can see on the lower surface of Marchantia, there are these little root-like structures, those little rhizoids that are sitting there, and those help to anchor the liverwort. If you ever go to pull one up, you'll find that those rhizoids are pretty tough. So on the upper surface, you can see little pores. These are little pores that allow for gases to enter and exit the organism. So if we just take a different look at Marchantia, this is more of a diagrammatic view of Marchantia. You can see the little pores at the top. It does have, a layering, okay, of tissues. You can see the rhizoid down here, the little thing that anchors the plant on the lower surface of it. We'll talk about parenchyma and chlorenchyma. We'll do that later on when we talk about plant structure. But there are air chambers in there, and then there are cells that undergo photosynthesis. Okay, so, it does have a body and a structure to it. There's the little gemma-cups I was talking to you about. You can see all of them. Aren't they cool? Look at all of them all over the surface of the plant. Here they're magnified a little bit, and you can see the gemmy inside there. Those are the little asexual structures that when a raindrop splashes, they'll shoot out all over the place, and each of those will become a new liverwort. So Marchantia has been well studied, and we know that Marchantia has female gametophytes and there are male gametophytes. So there are female, gametophytes that produce eggs. The female structure is called the archegonium. This is the structure that will house the egg. The antheridium is the male structure that will undergo a process to produce the sperm cells. Okay. Now, since these are haploid, that process is mitosis. So remember, these structures, because they're gametophytes, are haploid. There are already only one set of chromosomes, so they undergo mitosis to produce the eggs and the sperm. Kind of in this diagram, you can see that this is a little higher than the male part, so the female part's a little higher than the male part. So when a raindrop comes in and splashes, it splashes it to the underside. So it splashes it to the underside, so the sperm only have a short distance to actually swim. Now these do have flagellated sperm, so they do still have to swim to the egg. Now this appears small on my screen, so I'm going to use my zoom function, which does not allow me to use my stylus pen. But I think it'll be worthwhile to look at it a little bit more close up. So we're going to look at the life cycle of Marchantia. Follow your study guide. Your study guide will tell you what life cycles you need to know and which life cycles you don't need to know. So make sure you study the correct things, because there is a huge amount of material that you need to study, but you want to focus in on that study guide to allow you to know what things to focus on. Okay, so this is the life cycle. Let's start up here with the spores. Now remember, spores are going to be produced by sporangia. So if we go back here, these are the sporophytes that are going to produce those spores. The spores are going to be produced and they're going to be dropped out, and these spores are going to be haploid. They're going to begin to undergo mitosis and produce these little young gametophytes. Now in Marchantia, the gametophytes are either male or they're female. So this is a male gametophyte and a female gametophyte. I think I just had that backwards, my apologies. So this is going to be the male gametophyte and the female gametophyte over here. The female gametophyte is going to produce the archegoniophore, which produces the archegonium and houses the eggs. The male will produce the antheridiophore, which will produce eventually the sperm cells. So the male gametophyte produces sperm cells, female gametophyte produces egg cells. They do that in the process of mitosis. And when a raindrop hits, you can see that it catches some of the sperm cells, and perhaps they splash them up into the archegoniophore so they can swim to the egg cell. So just taking it down here, we have the sperm swimming to the archegonia. The archegonia, if the sperm actually make it to the archegonium, they'll actually fertilize the egg cell in the process of fertilization. So the haploid nuclei of the egg and the sperm will fuse. They'll produce a diploid zygote. Okay, 2 sets of chromosomes, because the sperm cell and egg cell just came into and fused together. So here you have the developing zygote that produces an embryo. As it goes through mitosis, it produces an embryo. So the embryo is going to have sporogenous tissues that will undergo meiosis to produce spores. So meiosis is the reduction division. Remember, to produce spores, you have to go from diploid to making haploid structures, and so they have to undergo meiosis to do that. That sporophyte will grow, and you can see down here that the sporogenous tissue is undergoing meiosis to produce spores. There are these little structures called elaters in there, and these will dry up and then twist as they dry to disperse the spores. So they'll twist and curl, and eventually the sporangium will open up and they'll shoot the spores or drop the spores out of the sporangium. So the sporangium, you can see, is on this female gametophyte head, and it's going to drop the spores. So you can see in this life cycle, the gametophyte is dominant. The sporophyte is not dominant. It actually is dependent upon the gametophyte. Okay, so that's the life cycle of Marchantia. So mosses are our next group of bryophytes. There's about 9,500 species of those. And there's three major types that you may come in contact with. We have peat moss, and we have the granite or rock moss, and then we have what we call true moss. And these are just some of the different kinds of mosses being described here. So here we have feathery mosses that kind of look like feathers, or even somewhat like fern plants, fern-like, but they're not ferns. Here we have cushiony mosses. My favorite is the pincushion moss, and that's very common around here in this area. They look like little pin cushions. And so let's go over here. So I'm just showing you several types of them that are common around here. Polytrichum is the genus name of this particular moss, and it's just kind of a stereotypical moss life cycle. I think I'll zoom in here again. I think it's easier to see. So we could start anywhere in this life cycle. Let's start at this time at fertilization. So at fertilization, we have the archegonia and the antheridia. So the sperm cells will be transported from the male gametophyte to the female gametophyte, and the sperm cells will swim down to the archegonium. And if it meets the archegonium, it may fertilize the egg cell. Fertilization will produce a zygote. That zygote will undergo mitosis. It will produce an embryo. The young embryo will grow and grow and grow. Notice it's dependent upon the gametophyte. It'll grow and it will produce this little sporangium here, this little sporophyte, and at the tip of it is the sporangium. That sporangium will have cells, sporogenous tissue that will undergo meiosis, and it will produce spores. Those spores will be released, and they may produce a female gametophyte, or they may produce a male gametophyte, but they do undergo mitosis to produce the gametophyte. Remember, the gametophyte is haploid, and all the cells here only have one set of chromosomes. So the male gametophyte is going to produce, it's called the antheridia, and it's going to produce the sperm cells. Female gametophyte has the archegonia, and it produces the egg cells. And sperm cells plus egg cells create fertilization, or have a fertilization and create the zygote. You can see there's a common theme. That original theme that we learned shows you the common theme, and then each different plant we go over will have some slight differences or modifications of that common theme. This is just showing you a pictorial view of a gametophyte. So you can see here the archegonium is producing the young embryo. This is the sporophyte growing out of the gametophyte. Here is the sporangium, and this is a little capsule that's opened up, allowing spores to be released. These are the little spores, and they will undergo mitosis to produce the young gametophyte. This is just showing you a trichium, a different kind of moss. This is the gametophyte. So if you ever go out and see moss plants, the little green structures are the gametophyte, and then the other structures coming out are the sporophytes. Those are the sporangia that will produce the spores that will be released. Okay. So that's just a moss plant showing you gametophyte and sporophyte. So let me talk about peat for a second. These are pretty important creatures, these peat bogs that you might see. Peat bogs exist in Virginia, but they also exist all over the world. They're mostly found at higher latitudes, closer to the poles where you have tundra. But all of this stuff you see out here is peat moss. Now, peatlands and peat bogs are really, really, really important at regulating the chemistry of the atmosphere. So you know in the air that you're breathing right now, there's carbon dioxide, there is nitrogen gas, and there's also oxygen. So those gases that are in the atmosphere are regulated by various things like algae in the ocean or plants on land. So peatlands serve as carbon storage areas. They're what we call carbon sinks. So as the plants undergo photosynthesis and they die, they fall in these peat bogs. They fall into an oxygen poor area. Typically, these peat bogs are very aquatic. There's lots of water there, and when these peat plants die, they store carbon in this waterlogged soil. They store carbon indefinitely until either the peat bog burns or people mine it and burn it or use it in some kind of agricultural reason. So around the world, peat contains about 30% of all carbon, and if we release that carbon, if we release that carbon into the atmosphere, then the atmosphere chemistry changes and we have more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The consequence of having more carbon dioxide is that carbon dioxide is a global warming gas. It traps heat that's being released from the land into space at night. It traps that heat and doesn't allow it to escape, thus warming the surface of the earth. And that has consequences to it that we'll be talking about. So around the world, people are trying to preserve peat bogs because in the past we have taken and used peat bogs for getting peat. Peat is a material that we add to soils to make it more to help it retain water more efficiently. And you can see this gentleman here is mining the peat. He's sitting it over to the side and letting it dry out in these little piles that you can see. And this is just a little trench that they've dug through. And you can see how deep the peat is. It can be very, very deep. So we can't continue to do this. We can't continue to mine peat forever and ever because of the carbon dioxide gas that is released when you bring it out of the peat bog. Decomposition will cause the gases to be released over time. Okay, so many governments around the world that have peat bogs are preserving them to try to trap the carbon dioxide and keep it out of the atmosphere. And you can read this on your own. I'm not going to read all of these things to you, but these are just some bodies that are found in peat bogs. These are famous bodies found in peat bogs. A long time ago, the Celtic people had religious ceremonies where they did human sacrifice, and they would dump bodies into the peat bogs to offer as sacrifice to their gods. And some of the bodies are preserved perfectly, almost skin and organs are intact, and they're just kind of cool. So read about those, and maybe you'll find some interest in that as well. Well, our next group of bryophytes are the hornworts, and I can't say that I found too many of these creatures before, so I don't have a lot to say about them. But hornworts are in Virginia. I just never discovered them, and I've looked pretty hard for them. But perhaps I'll go out with a botanist sometime, and they'll be able to show me one of those. But they are cool creatures, and you can see the little sporophytes sticking up in the gametophytes. They are bryophytes. Well, eventually plants evolved vascular tissue. You can begin to see some of that evolution in the bryophytes. As you get into more and more advanced bryophytes, they have more and more tissues that are looking vascular and maybe one day will be classified as being vascular. So these vascular plants have phloem and xylem, and this vascular tissue is conducting tissue. Okay, so they don't have arteries and veins, but they do have almost like straw-like vessels that allow them to conduct sugar and water. Phloem, and you might as well go ahead and get to know this, phloem is going to be the vascular tissue that conducts sugar and some water that the sugar is suspended in. Xylem predominantly is going to carry water and minerals through the plant. So in these plants that became vascular, the sporophyte generation is going to be the dominant generation. They're going to have branched sporophytes. If you notice in the bryophytes, they just had a single non-branched sporophyte that came out of the gametophyte. The earliest vascular plants are seedless. Okay, so the seed hadn't evolved at that particular time, and there are still seedless vascular plants on Earth today, and we'll look at some of those. There are two phyla of these early non-seed vascular plants that we'll talk about today, and then we'll deal with the more complex vascular plants later on. So Lycophyta is a group or phyla of vascular non-seed plants that we'll talk about today. And then Manilophyta or Pterophyta is the modern day is another modern day phyla of plants. So let's talk about Lycophyta first, phylum Lycophyta first. There are three members: club moss, spike moss, and quillworts. So these over here are your club moss, and you're probably familiar with these. You see them all over the place around here. Running ground cedar would be a common name of one that we have around here. Some people use those for decorating during Christmas time as kind of like as a garland that they'll put inside their house or make wreaths out of even. This is a spike moss. I have this in my yard, so it's a relatively common lycophyte that's in this area. And then this is a quillwort. Isoetes is the kind of the genus name of that. And I can't say I've ever seen Isoetes. They're in the United States. They're in this area, but they're you have to be in the right habitat in order to find them. Typically, they're found in mountainous areas. So this is Selaginella, the one that I find in my yard, the spike moss that I find in my yard. So these are the ones you're probably most common or most familiar with, the club moss. So this is running ground cedar here, and it's been flattened out for you to look at. You can see the little sporophytes over here. If you are ever at Patrick Henry Community College, take a walk on our little trail, and you'll see running ground cedar everywhere. And right now, as I'm doing this lecture, they actually have lots of the sporophytes producing the spores. So if I just show you a life cycle, you'll notice that it looks very similar to the life cycle that we've already studied. We have fertilization and we have meiosis, the two sides of the thing. We have gametophytes and we have sporophytes. So at fertilization, the sperm cells and egg cells come together and form a zygote. That zygote will begin to grow and it will produce a sporophyte. Now, in this particular organism, the gametophyte is very, very reduced in size. So we have a very reduced in size gametophyte. The sporophyte will grow, and that's what you're going to see is mostly the plant. Unless you dig up a gametophyte, you're not going to find one. You'll see mainly the sporophyte. So the sporophyte has these spore-producing structures down here called a strobolus. The sporangium is going to produce the spores. It'll have sporogenous tissue that will undergo meiosis to produce spores. So you can see that the spores are being produced by meiosis. Why meiosis? Because the sporogenous tissue is diploid. It has to undergo meiosis to produce haploid spores. So the spores will undergo mitosis to produce the gametophyte, and here you can see the gametophyte is growing. In this particular example, the antheridium and the archegonium, the male part and the female part that produces sperm and then egg, they're on the same plant. Okay, so they still probably utilize water because the sperm cell are flagellated and they swim to the archegonium to fertilize the egg. Okay, so that would be the life cycle of Lycopodium or running ground cedar. This is a spike moss. It's a nice little plant. It creeps on the ground, and it's pretty easy to tell the difference between it and a liverwort. If you notice right here, there are these little branching leaves. Liverworts don't have these little branching leaves. Also, you can see vascular tissue inside of these plants, which liverworts don't have. These are quillworts. You can see there's a unique habitat here. This looks like a granitic or granite outcrop, and it's a high altitude place, and you have isoetes growing all in here. So those are quillworts. So let's talk about the manilophytes. These will be your ferns and your horsetails and whisk ferns. Ferns I have great familiarity with, and horsetails too. Whisk ferns not so much. So these are seedless. They produce spores. They don't produce seeds yet. So that's going to be more complex plants that produce seeds. They do have vascular tissue, so they do have roots and leaves and stems. So they have flagellated sperm, which means they're going to have water in order to reproduce. The sporophyte is the dominant generation. Notice in the bryophytes, the gametophyte was the dominant generation. And this is just showing you a fern. I'm sure you're familiar with ferns, but there are some terms that you should know about ferns. So if we look at the whole leaf of a fern, that's called a frond. Okay, so the leaf is a frond. So there is a blade, which is kind of like the part that has the leaf-like structures, and then there's a little stem called a petiole that anchors the plant into the rhizome. The rhizome would be kind of like a modified stem, and then you can see there's roots down there to anchor it into the ground. Okay, so that's what a fern basically is containing. This little stem right here is called a rachis, and then we have little leaf-like structures called pinna or pinnules that are making up this particular leaf. The young leaf is coiled up. Okay, it's a highly coiled structure, and it basically colloquially is called a fiddlehead. I mean, I guess you can see that it looks like a fiddlehead. I actually mess around with a violin, and every time I look at the end of my violin, I always think of a fern. So these are rhizomes here, and that will be a modified stem, and then you have your roots coming down to anchor it. Again, you have your mycorrhizal, fungal connections down there to help the plant undergo absorption of minerals and water. Some people, and I'm not advocating that you do this, but some people do, will cook up fiddleheads and eat them. But I don't advocate that you eat anything in nature unless you're 100% sure that you're not going to die from eating it. This life cycle is a little bit bigger, so I guess I'll use my stylus to help us to kind of see some things. So here, let's start at the sporangium. It undergoes the process of meiosis. Remember, the sporangium is diploid. So all the tissues have two sets of chromosomes, so we have to undergo meiosis to produce the spores. So the spore is haploid, and it can undergo mitosis to produce the young gametophyte. This gametophyte is going to grow and grow and grow and grow, and eventually it will have antheridium, the male part, and archegonium, the female part. The archegonium produces the eggs, the antheridium produces the sperm. Sperm are still motile, they have to swim to the egg. Okay, so we have to have water for this to happen. Fertilization will eventually happen, and a zygote will form once the sperm cells and egg cells unite. That zygote will undergo mitosis to produce the gametophyte. Excuse me, the sporophyte. My apologies. The gametophyte will stay underground. It'll be small. You'll probably never ever see a fern gametophyte unless you dig them up underground, and they're going to be really, really small. They are heart-like in shape if you ever dig one up. That sporophyte will grow and grow and grow, and it will be the dominant part that you will see. In this example of a fern, on the bottom side, the sporangium will undergo meiosis, and they'll produce spores. So if your significant other ever gives you flowers and they have ferns, look on the back side and see if you can see the sporangium and the spores that are forming. This may be what they look like. There'll be little brown dots on the backside surface of it, and there will be billions and billions of spores, or perhaps millions and millions of spores that will be produced from that. Ferns are cool. They're available. You should be able to see them everywhere. And if you can't see them, go to a florist or go to Walmart, take a look at them. So horsetails are another kind of manilophyte, and these are vascular and they're seedless. And this is a true horsetail here, and it probably is called a horsetail because it looks like a horse's tail. Over here we have scouring rush, and this is the one that's pretty common in our area. And they're very, very tough. They have lots of silica or sand-like material that's inside of their stem, so they're very stiff. And people used to use them to scour out, the pioneers used to use them to scour out their pots and to clean pots with it. That's why they're called scouring rush. This is just showing you strobilus, which is going to be the spore-producing part of the scouring rush. And then these are the whisk ferns. Whisk ferns are not really in our area. They're more of they're found in other environments that we don't have. So I won't say too much about them. Just mention that there are whisk ferns out there, and this is what they look like. So it probably won't have too many test questions on whisk ferns. Well, that, my friends, is the lecture on kind of an introduction to plants, what a plant is, and then we talked about also kind of the evolution or transition from water plants into land plants, and then we talked about bryophytes and the bryophytes, and then we talked about some of the vascular seedless plants. So if you have any questions, as usual, please email me. Make sure you get your study guides done. Remember, you can work with one other individual in study guides if you want to. Sometimes that's good to fact check and to make sure your answers are correct. Study guides are going to be key to you doing well on tests, so make sure you take and get that done. Make sure you keep up with all your activities and your work, get everything turned in on time, and don't feel alone. You can email other people, you can go to the discussion board on Blackboard and discuss things with each other, email me, but don't feel like you're out there by yourself doing all the work by yourself. Okay, until later, I will see you next time.